The wind-swept shores of the Baltic Sea once cradled a small, slow-moving people whose name would echo quietly through European history. The Gepids. Their name likely comes from a Gothic word meaning slow or sluggish, perhaps a teasing nickname that somehow stuck. Yet there was nothing sluggish about their story. They began far from the Carpathian Basin, where they would later rule in the pine forests, rocky islands and cold coasts of southern Scandinavia, looking out over grey, restless water. As you settle in and get comfortable, imagine those long northern twilights where the first Gepid families tended fires, sharpened iron tools and dreamed of lands to the south. Archaeologists have uncovered clues to this beginning in southern Sweden, especially in places like Västergötland, Östergötland, and the island of Gotland. Graves from the 1st and 2nd centuries show weapons, ornaments and burial customs that later appear again far away in Gepid lands. These burials are carefully arranged north-south with spearheads and metalwork laid beside the dead, as if their owners would need them beyond the grave. Even in silence, these objects whisper of a people already skilled with iron, already aware of Rome's distant glitter, and already preparing, slowly, to move. Language joins archaeology in tracing their path. The Gepids spoke an East Germanic tongue related to Gothic, and their recorded personal names echo Old Norse sounds carved in Scandinavian runes. Place names in southern Sweden preserve old roots that match Gepid words like faint footprints frozen in the landscape. As you drift towards sleep, you can picture it, a small tribe on the northern fringe of the world, not yet a kingdom, not yet famous or feared, just one of many Germanic peoples, but already carrying the seeds of a long and dramatic journey. Early Gepid society did not begin as a centralized kingdom with a single, commanding king on a shining throne. Instead, it was a loose, tribal confederation, a web of kin groups tied together by oaths, shared dangers, and common ambitions. Power rested in the hands of war leaders who led their own bands and sat together in councils, arguing, boasting, and negotiating in smoky halls. These chieftains owed each other loyalty in war, and their followers repaid them with service, feasting, and respect. It was a world where reputation mattered more than written laws, and where courage could lift a family for generations. Burial sites along the southern Baltic coast in Pomerania and the Vistula River basin show that even in this early phase, Gepid society was layered. Some graves are rich with imported Roman goods, elaborate weapons, and shining ornaments in silver and bronze. Others are simple, filled with local pottery and basic tools. The contrast suggests clear social ranks, elites who could trade with Rome and command warriors, and common folk who farmed, herded animals, and provided the backbone of Gepid life. The dead rest side by side, but their grave goods show how unequal their lives had been. Around them lived other East Germanic peoples, Goths, Vandals, and Burgundians. Relations were a mix of cooperation and rivalry. Shared burial customs and similar objects show that Gepids and Goths in particular often moved in parallel, traded, and may have intermarried. With Vandals and others, the picture is more complex, periods of peaceful exchange interrupted by bursts of destructive conflict. Imagine quiet winters of trade and storytelling, broken suddenly by summers of raids and burning settlements. In this shifting world, the Gepids learned to fight, to bargain, and to adapt, skills they would need when the wider world began to crumble. Religion for the early Gepids, like for many Germanic peoples, was woven from warrior cults, ancestor veneration, and a sacred respect for weapons. In their cemeteries, elaborate graves contain complete weapon sets arranged with ritual care around the body. Spears, shield bosses, and single-edged scramasax swords lie in patterns that suggest more than simple burial. But these arrangements hint at ceremonies meant to guide the warrior, into an afterlife where he would fight alongside gods and honored ancestors. Even in death, a fighter remained a fighter. Women's graves tell another part of the story. They often contain bronze brooches, strings of glass beads, and spinning tools. These objects were practical, but they were also symbols of status and identity. A finely dressed woman with imported beads and intricate brooches was not just someone's wife or daughter. She was a visible sign of her family's wealth and connections. Through weaving, spinning, and managing the household, women anchored the social world that warriors fought to defend. In a quiet way, their tools were as important to the tribe's survival as any sword. The Gepids practiced weapon sacrifice as well. Archaeologists find spears and swords deliberately bent or broken before being placed in graves. By killing these weapons, the Gepids seem to have believed they released their spirit to accompany the dead into the beyond. Graves tend to align north-south, with faces turned toward the living lands to the south, as if even the dead gazed in that direction. As you breathe slowly, you can imagine standing at the edge of such a cemetery at dusk, rows of low mounds under a pale sky, each one holding a story, a family, and a belief that life and death were part of one long battlefield. Beneath these religious and social layers lay the everyday rhythms of Gepid life. Their economy was mixed and flexible, combining pastoral nomadism with seasonal farming. Settlement sites show bones of cattle and sheep, telling us they herded animals over open land, while charred grains reveal fields of wheat, barley, and millet tended when conditions allowed. Some years they would move more often, following pastures and opportunities. In more peaceful times they settled longer, sowed crops, and watched golden fields ripple in the wind. Their pottery tells of both daily needs and special occasions. Simple cooking pots bear soot from constant use on hearths, while finer vessels appear in feasting contexts and graves, suggesting gatherings where meat, drink, and stories flowed. These feasts likely strengthened bonds between kin groups, confirmed alliances, and allowed leaders to reward followers. Imagine the flicker of firelight on polished metal, the murmur of voices, and the clatter of cups as pledges were made and remembered. In such moments, politics, faith, and friendship merged. The real marvel, though, was their metalwork. Gepid smiths were already skilled artisans, mastering iron in ways that demanded patience and deep understanding. They controlled carbon content, quenched blades to harden them, and used pattern welding to create strong, flexible weapons. Their spearheads featured long tangs driven deep into the shaft, giving them greater strength than many rival designs. In a world where a weapon could decide your fate, these technical details mattered. They also gave the Gepids a quiet advantage, one that would become critical when the great storms of migration rolled over Europe. By the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was entering one of its most turbulent phases. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, often killed by their own soldiers. Frontiers once carefully fortified and supplied began to weaken as Rome's attention turned inward. Along the Rhine and Danube, garrisons were stretched thin, commanders were distracted, and old systems of subsidies and diplomacy broke down. To peoples beyond the frontier, this looked less like crisis and more like opportunity. The Gepids, along with many other Germanic tribes, watched Rome's troubles closely. At first, they probed the borders with small raids, quick strikes against isolated farms or poorly defended depots, not to conquer, but to test Roman reactions. These early raids brought back both wealth and information. They revealed where defenses were strong, where they were weak, and how quickly legions could respond. With each trip, Gepid leaders learned more about the giant to the south, whose riches shimmered just beyond the river. Meanwhile, pressures from the north and east were building. Population growth, climate shifts, and competition for land all contributed to a growing urge to move southward. Rivers like the Vistula became migration corridors, lined with temporary camps used during long journeys. Archaeological evidence shows patterns of seasonal occupation, camps where Gepid groups stayed through winter, then abandoned as they resumed their slow drift toward the Danube. As you lie still, you can imagine those caravans of families, wagons, and herds inching south year after year, not yet knowing that an even greater force was moving toward them from the distant steppes. That force was the Huns. Sometime in the early 3rd century, mounted warriors from the Eurasian steppes began pushing westward, crossing great rivers and sweeping into the lands north of the Black Sea. Their arrival set off a chain reaction. Established Germanic groups like the Alans and Goths were driven from their homes, forced into new territories, or pushed toward Roman borders. What had once been a slow migration became a series of sudden, desperate movements. The Gepids were caught in this great reshuffling. Allied with Gothic confederations but pursuing their own interests, they now faced waves of displaced peoples crashing into regions they had begun to claim. Archaeological layers from settlements along rivers such as the Dniester show signs of hurried abandonment, hidden hoards of valuables, hastily built defenses, and simpler pottery replacing earlier decorative styles. These clues suggest communities under stress, preferring survival to beauty. The Gepids were learning that the world they knew was ending. As Roman frontiers faltered and new enemies appeared, the Gepids began to shift from cautious raiders to serious contenders for land. They probed deeper along the lower Danube, raiding more boldly while still gauging Roman responses. Between the chaos inside the empire and the thunder of hooves behind them, they sensed that a new balance of power was emerging, a dangerous, unstable balance in which they might rise or be swept away. And somewhere, as campfires burned low and children slept, elders must have wondered which fate awaited them. A turning point came with Emperor Aurelian's decision in the 270s to abandon the province of Dacia, north of the Danube. Rome could no longer hold this rich territory with its fertile fields and valuable mines. By pulling back behind the river, Aurelian created a power vacuum in the Carpathian Basin, one that many groups raced to fill. To ambitious peoples like the Gepids, it was as though an entire province had been placed on a table and left unguarded. The Goths quickly established themselves in parts of the region. The Carpi and other Dacian groups still held mountain passes and fortified strongholds. Sarmatian cavalry roamed the plains, searching for grazing lands. Into this crowded, contested landscape came the Gepids, moving with a mixture of caution and determination. Instead of trying to seize everything at once, their leaders pursued a clever strategy: negotiate, divide, and secure the most defensible and valuable core. Through deals and shifting alliances, the Gepids secured control of central Transylvania, the plateau ringed by mountains, rich in farmland and resources, and threaded with trade routes linking the Danube and the Black Sea. Archaeological sites like Murashesti reveal planned villages with rectangular timber houses around central courtyards, protected by palisades. Stone from abandoned Roman buildings was reused for foundations, while timber superstructures reflected Germanic styles. A new way of life was forming, neither purely nomadic nor fully Roman, but something in between. Settling these lands forced the Gepids to adapt quickly. Hunters and wandering herders now had to think like farmers and administrators. Fields needed ploughing and rotation, grain required storage, and villages had to be defended year after year. Iron ploughshares, combining Roman design with Germanic smithing skills, cut into soil that had once fed imperial legions. Wheat, barley, and millet became staples of Gepid wealth, filling granaries that would support both people and armies. The old Roman infrastructure did not vanish overnight. Roads, bridges, and ruins of villas still marked the landscape. Romanized inhabitants, Latin-speaking farmers, craftsmen, and Christian communities remained in many places. Gepid rulers often chose pragmatic coexistence over destruction. They demanded tribute, labor, and loyalty, but allowed local customs and religion to continue. In return, they gained experienced workers, access to Roman-style technology, and a smoother transition from roaming to ruling. Archaeology shows this blend clearly. In Gepid settlements, we find Roman-style pottery kilns beside Germanic weaving tools and Christian symbols appearing alongside traditional designs in jewelry and metalwork. Coins include both imperial issues and local imitations that merge Roman imagery with new motifs. As you relax, you can imagine a Gepid village at dusk, a timber hall built on Roman stone, smoke curling into the sky, Latin prayers whispered in one house, while, in another, old gods are honored with food and drink. The kingdom was taking shape in layers like sediment on a riverbed. As the Gepids rooted themselves in Dacia and the Banat, their economy deepened and expanded. The Carpathian foothills offered salt deposits, a precious resource in an age of preserved meat and long-distance trade. Mines that Rome had once managed now helped fill Gepid treasuries. Farmers tilled revitalized fields, craftsmen produced tools, weapons, and jewelry, and traders carried surplus down rivers and roads. The kingdom's wealth no longer came only from raids, but from steady production and control of key routes. Workshops turned out not just everyday tools, but also fine objects in a distinct Gepid style. Gold and garnet cloisonné jewelry, intricate designs made of tiny settings, filled with glowing stones, became a hallmark of high status. These pieces traveled far, turning up in Gothic, Vandal, and even Frankish territories, proof of trade networks stretching across Europe. For a small kingdom, this reputation for craftsmanship was a kind of soft power, earning respect and desire in distant courts. To protect this emerging prosperity, the Gepids invested heavily in fortifications. Engineers, borrowing from both Roman and Germanic traditions, built strongholds at river crossings and on high ground. These forts guarded trade routes, provided safe havens in times of war, and symbolized royal authority. Yet even as walls rose and villages flourished, distant hoofbeats echoed again. The Huns were no longer a vague rumor on the steppe. They were becoming the dominant power in the region, and the Gepids would soon have to decide whether to resist, submit, or somehow do both at once. The Hunnic Confederation was unlike anything the Gepids had faced before. It was a swirling coalition of steppe peoples, subjugated tribes, and captured specialists, Roman engineers, Germanic infantry, and Iranian horsemen, all harnessed to the will of Hunnic leaders. Their armies moved with astonishing speed, composed of mounted archers who could strike, disappear, and return before slower enemies could react. The old methods of static defense and purely infantry-based fighting were suddenly inadequate. At first, Hunnic pressure on Gepid territory was indirect. Allies and neighbors were pushed into Gepid lands, bringing tales of burning villages and relentless cavalry raids. Refugee Alans arrived with detailed descriptions of composite bows, scale armor, and terrifying tactics. Gepid leaders listened carefully. They strengthened fortifications, trained more cavalry, and opened diplomatic channels. Direct confrontation with the Huns would be risky, but total submission would be worse. They aimed instead for a third option, federation. By the early 5th century, the Gepids had accepted a form of Hunnic overlordship in exchange for retaining their lands and internal authority. They owed tribute and military service, but they were not erased. Gepid warriors joined Hunnic campaigns against both Eastern and Western Rome, marching and riding alongside other federate peoples. With each campaign, they brought home riches, silver plates, gold jewelry, silk textiles, and something even more valuable, exposure to new techniques in warfare, craftsmanship, and administration. Under Hunnic shadow, the Gepids changed again, quietly preparing for the day that shadow might lift. Service under the Huns transformed Gepid society in subtle but powerful ways. Militarily, they adopted more cavalry tactics, integrating mounted units with their traditional infantry. Archaeological finds from this period show an increase in horse gear, bits, spurs and saddles, along with weapons suited to fast-moving warfare. Yet the Gepids never abandoned their core strength in disciplined infantry, instead developing hybrid formations that could meet different enemies on varied terrain. Their metalwork also advanced. Contact with Iranian and Central Asian craftsmen within the Hunnic sphere introduced new forging methods, including the use of higher quality steel and improved heat treatment. Gepid smiths began producing blades with exceptional cutting power and resilience, blending older Germanic techniques with Eastern knowledge. Decorative arts absorbed influences too, steppe motifs, and exotic materials like silk and semi-precious stones began to appear in Gepid graves, far from the steppes themselves. At the same time, wealth and status became more concentrated. Elite graves from this period are overflowing with precious metals, imported goods, and finely crafted weapons, while common burials show more continuity with earlier traditions. The ruling families who led Gepid contingents on Hunnic campaigns gained power at home, turning military success into political dominance. Religious life grew more complex as well. Pagan practices persisted, but Christian symbols began appearing in some contexts, especially among communities in closer contact with Rome. The Gepid world, once simple and northern, was now tied into a vast and unstable empire. Everything changed with the death of Attila in 453. His passing tore open the seams of the Hunnic Confederation. Rival claimants struggled to control a loose network held together largely by his personal authority. Subject peoples sensed weakness and began to stir. Among them was the Gepid king Ardarix, a trusted Hunnic commander who had fought in many of Attila's campaigns and knew the strengths and weaknesses of the system from the inside. Ardaric understood that his people could not remain forever as loyal subordinates in a collapsing order. He built a coalition with other Germanic groups who had also borne the brunt of Hunnic demands: Rugians, Herulis, and Skiri. Diplomatic gift exchanges visible in sudden bursts of foreign luxury goods in Gepid graves hint at the intense negotiations behind this alliance. Quietly, preparations for revolt began, fortifications improved, weapons stockpiled, and loyalties tested. The decisive test came at the Battle of Nidau in 454, fought somewhere in the Pannonian plain. There, Ardaric's coalition met the forces of Attila's son, Elek, and the Hunnic loyalists. Archaeological evidence suggests a massive engagement with heavy casualties, piles of abandoned weapons, and signs of thorough looting after the fight. The coalition's hybrid tactics, Germanic infantry shield walls supported by cavalry trained in Hunnic methods, proved devastating. Elek fell, and with him fell Hunnic dominance in Central Europe. As the dust settled, the Gepids emerged not as mere survivors, but as leaders of a newly open political landscape. With the Huns shattered, Ardaric moved quickly to turn victory into lasting power. The Gepids occupied former Hunnic strongholds across Dacia and eastern Pannonia, seizing warehouses, crossing points, and administrative centers. From these bases, they negotiated recognition from both Western and Eastern Roman empires, presenting themselves as a stabilizing force rather than just another raiding tribe. Diplomatic correspondence and imperial gifts show that Constantinople, in particular, understood their strategic importance. The independent Gepid kingdom took shape across the Transylvanian plateau, the Banat, and parts of Pannonia. Its heart lay in regions long familiar to them, but its reach now extended along crucial trade corridors between the Danube, the Balkans, and the Black Sea. Material culture from this time spreads widely, Gepid-style jewellery and weapons appear across the Carpathian Basin, marking the footprint of their new authority. Their capital focus gravitated toward major cities like Sirmium, a former Roman centre whose position on great rivers made it invaluable. Administration had to evolve quickly. The Gepids began blending their traditional assembly-based politics with elements borrowed from Roman and even Hunnic practice. Latin writing entered royal service, seals and written records appear alongside older, oral customs. Law codes, now lost to us but hinted at in later references, likely mixed Germanic customary law with Roman legal principles. In court halls, disputes would be settled not only by memory and witnesses, but by written decisions and official seals. For a people once known as slow, the Gepids adapted with impressive speed. After Ardaric, later kings such as Gundaric, often called Gundarit or similar forms in modern reconstructions, presided over what many historians view as a Gepid golden age. Beginning in the later 5th century, the kingdom enjoyed roughly 70 years of prominence in the Carpathian Basin. It controlled rich lands, key river crossings, and important nodes on the routes linking east and west. Grain, salt, metal, and crafted goods flowed through Gepid markets, filling royal coffers and supporting a professionalized military. Urban centers, especially Sirmium, grew and changed under Gepid rule. Excavations show impressive building programs, palaces combining Roman stonework with Germanic hall designs, administrative complexes where officials counted tribute and resolved legal disputes, and fortified walls strengthened to withstand new forms of siege warfare. In these cities, languages and cultures mingled: Latin, Gothic, East Germanic dialects, and perhaps Slavic tongues, all echoing in busy streets and markets. The army, too, was reshaped. Instead of temporary warbands, summoned only in times of crisis, the Gepids developed permanent units stationed at strategic fortresses. Equipment becomes more standardized in the archaeological record, suggesting centralized production and royal oversight. Heavy cavalry, siege specialists, and trained engineers join traditional spearmen and shield bearers. As you breathe slowly, you can imagine the kingdom in this period, its banners flying over river forts, its kings corresponding with emperors, its craftsmen sending glittering ornaments across half of Europe. It looked strong, confident, and secure. But its neighbors were changing as well. One of the first major tests of Gepid power in this golden age came from the Ostrogoths. After the Hunnic collapse, they too sought territory in Pannonia and along the Danube. Control of forts like Singidunum, modern Belgrade, meant control of vital river junctions and access toward Italy and the Balkans. In 473, Gothic forces under Theodoric tried to secure Singidunum and the surrounding region, challenging Gepid authority directly. The siege that followed was long and punishing. The Goths employed traditional Germanic siege methods: earth ramps, battering rams, and persistent assaults on the walls. Inside, Gepid defenders relied on a mix of old and new techniques: shield walls atop fortifications, torsion artillery, hurling projectiles, and perhaps incendiary substances learned via Byzantine contacts. Archaeology around the site reveals extensive siege works, collapsed fortifications, and layers of destruction and repair. It must have felt like an endless test of endurance for everyone trapped within range of the walls. In the end, the Gepids prevailed. The siege was lifted, and a peace settlement recognized their control over Sirmium and central Pannonia, while allowing the Ostrogoths passage through their lands on the way to Italy. This settlement reflected Gundaric's far-sighted diplomacy. He recognized that pushing the Goths into Italy could turn a dangerous rival into a distant power, while preserving a potential partner against other threats. For the moment, the Middle Danube belonged to the Gepids, but new centers of strength were forming in Italy, Gaul, and Constantinople, each watching the region with interest. As the 6th century approached, the broader European chessboard shifted. the Ostrogoths established a kingdom in Italy. The Franks expanded in Gaul under Clovis and his successors. In the east, the Byzantine Empire remained a powerful, if sometimes overstretched, player. The Gepid kings had to navigate between these stronger neighbours while preserving their autonomy. King Trisaric, or Thrasaric in some reconstructions, is remembered for forging a crucial treaty with Byzantium. Under its terms, the Gepids became recognized federates of the Eastern Empire. They received annual subsidies, gold and goods, in exchange for helping guard the Danube frontier and supplying troops when needed. This arrangement suited both sides. The Gepids gained steady resources and legitimacy, while the Byzantines secured a buffer state against more distant threats. This closer relationship brought increased cultural exchange. Byzantine luxury items, silk, silver tableware, jeweled crosses appear more frequently in Gepid elite graves. Artistic motifs begin to blend classical and Germanic elements. Religious dynamics also grew more complicated. Many of the Romanized populations within Gepid lands were Christian, often following Arian or Orthodox traditions. The kings, needing their cooperation and Byzantine goodwill, gradually leaned toward Arian Christianity while still tolerating older pagan beliefs. The kingdom was becoming not just a political crossroads but a religious one as well. Under a later ruler often named Thraustila or Thraustella in modern reconstructions, the Gepid kingdom reached the height of its territorial expansion and administrative maturity. Their domains stretched across much of the central Carpathian Basin, including additional Pannonian lands that brought them into closer contact and conflict with Lombards and other Germanic groups along the Danube. Sirmium blossomed further as a cosmopolitan capital, combining Roman urban structures with Germanic political power. Urban planning reached impressive levels. Excavations reveal residential districts, commercial quarters, and religious buildings laid out with care. Specialized workshops produced goods for local use and distant trade, weapons, jewelry, textiles, and everyday tools. Fortresses at key locations were upgraded to withstand more sophisticated sieges, with multiple defensive lines, storage facilities, and dedicated quarters for garrisons. These forts served not only as military centers, but also as regional administrative hubs, where tribute was collected and royal orders enforced. Legal and bureaucratic systems were refined into something quite advanced for a post-Roman kingdom. A comprehensive legal code appears to have existed, blending Germanic custom with Roman legal logic. Copies, probably written in Latin, were likely sent to provincial centers, guiding judges and officials. Professional legal specialists and scribes emerge in the archaeological record through writing tools and seal rings. As you rest, you can imagine this world of scribes bent over parchment, soldiers drilling in courtyards, merchants haggling in markets, and priests chanting in newly built churches, a web of roles holding the kingdom together. Religion, which had once been purely pagan and tribal, now became a major organizing force in Gepid life. Over the later 5th and early 6th centuries, a gradual conversion to Arian Christianity took place, especially among elites and urban populations. This shift did not happen overnight. For a long time, Christian crosses and traditional amulets appeared together in graves, as if people were hedging their bets between old gods and the new faith. Arian Christianity, which taught that Christ was subordinate to God the Father, had been embraced by many Germanic peoples earlier, including the Goths and Vandals. For the Gepids, it offered both spiritual appeal and political utility. It aligned them with other Germanic Christian kingdoms and gave them a shared religious language with Byzantine diplomats, even if theological disagreements remained. Arian bishops gained influence not only as religious leaders but as literate administrators and diplomats who could read, write, and argue in the language of scripture and law. Churches began to rise in key centers, basilica-style buildings that blended Roman Christian forms with local construction habits. Some had timber framing, and Germanic decorative metalwork alongside classical layouts of nave, apse, and baptistry. Separate Christian burial grounds appeared near older cemeteries, showing how communities slowly reorganized around new beliefs. Yet weapon burials and feasting traditions persisted, adapted rather than abolished. The Gepids were weaving Christianity into their existing culture, not simply replacing one with the other. Christianization brought new institutions. Monasteries and church schools appeared, acting as centers of learning, diplomacy, and agriculture. A monastery near Sirmium, dedicated in some sources to St. Martin, became a hub of manuscript copying and correspondence with other Christian communities. Here, monks might copy biblical texts, legal documents, and letters from distant bishops, preserving knowledge in an age when many other records were being lost. Law codes and courts adapted to Christian ideas about marriage, inheritance, and morality. Canon law and Germanic custom coexisted, sometimes uneasily. Judges and bishops had to decide which rules applied in which cases, especially when disputes crossed ethnic or religious boundaries. Their decisions shaped daily life: who could inherit what, how crimes were punished, and how conflicts between blood-feud traditions and Christian forgiveness were handled. Over time, a hybrid legal culture emerged, both stern and flexible. Christian festivals slowly overlaid older seasonal celebrations. Harvest feasts were rededicated to saints associated with fertility and abundance. Warrior commemorations were linked to martyrs who had died in battle for their faith. Pilgrimages extended Gepid horizons further. Some believers traveled to holy sites in the Mediterranean, returning with relics, exotic objects, and stories of distant lands. In this way, the kingdom was tied into the wider Christian world, even as it kept its own flavor. The Gepids were no longer just a northern tribe, they were part of a broader, sacred geography. Yet while the Gepids refined their administration and deepened their faith, a new rival was gathering strength: the Lombards. Originating further north, they had moved southward, and by the early 6th century began pressing into western Pannonia. Their military style emphasized mobile infantry, supported by capable cavalry and archers, adapted to the forests and marshes of the Danube Basin. They were hungry for land, and the Gepid kingdom stood squarely in their way. At first, Gepid kings tried diplomacy. Boundaries were discussed, gifts exchanged, and temporary truces agreed upon. Archaeology on the frontier shows lavish metalwork and prestige goods crossing between Lombard and Gepid elites, tangible traces of these negotiations. But beneath the courteous surface, both sides prepared for war. Raiding increased, especially in disputed regions where villages were burned, crops destroyed, and captives taken. A major clash came near the fortress of Bassiana around 543. There, Lombard forces under King Audoin attempted to secure a strategic crossing over the Tisa River. The Gepid army responded with a mix of solid infantry and newly adapted cavalry and siege specialists. The battle seems to have been fierce but inconclusive. Weapon deposits and temporary fortifications from the site reveal complex maneuvers and extended operations. Neither kingdom could deliver a decisive blow, and a grinding pattern of war and uneasy peace set in. Both sides knew that eventually something or someone would tip the balance. Into this deadlock stepped the Byzantine Empire, always eager to shape events along the Danube. Constantinople preferred a divided, balanced frontier rather than a single, dominant Germanic power. When the Gepids seemed too strong, the Byzantines leaned toward the Lombards. When Lombard power rose, they reconsidered the Gepids. Diplomatic embassies traveled back and forth, laden with gold, silk, and fine weapons meant to buy loyalty or at least cooperation. In the mid-540s, the Gepids concluded a formal alliance with Byzantium aimed at strengthening the Danube frontier. Imperial engineers helped upgrade Gepid fortifications, and subsidies flowed into Gepid coffers in return for military assistance. Joint garrisons and shared strongholds show the practical side of this arrangement: Gothic, Gepid, and Roman-style equipment all turning up in the same layers of earth. For a moment it seemed that this partnership might secure the kingdom's position. The Lombards, however, refused to be outmaneuvered. They sought their own external ally and found one in a rising power beyond the Carpathians, the Avars. These steppe warriors, skilled in mounted combat and advanced siege techniques, promised exactly the kind of force that could break fortified, infantry-heavy resistance. Lombard diplomacy and generous gifts opened the door to an alliance with this formidable confederation. With Avar horsemen at their side, the Lombards hoped to crush Gepid resistance once and for all. The arrival of the Avars in the Danube world altered everything. Their cavalry speed, their siege engineering, and their hunger for plunder and pasture made them both ideal allies and deadly potential masters. At first, though, they fought alongside the Lombards, turning the strategic equation sharply against the Gepids. Battles along the frontier grew more intense, as Gepid fortresses that had withstood Germanic assaults now faced nomadic strategies perfected on the steppe. Sirmium, the jewel of the Gepid kingdom, became a prime target. Around 546, a massive siege began, with Lombard infantry and cavalry working alongside Avar mounted archers and siege crews. The city's defences, built and rebuilt over generations, were tested to the limit. Archaeological evidence reveals layers of siege works, tunnels, counter-tunnels, and hastily repaired walls. Inside, food ran low, disease likely spread, and the population endured a constant drumbeat of tension and fear. Yet the Gepids held out. Their engineers improvised new defences, their soldiers fought from walls and hidden positions, and their leaders coordinated with Byzantine allies to keep supplies trickling in. After nearly 2 years of intermittent fighting, the siege ended not with a dramatic storming, but with exhaustion and shifting priorities. The coalitions frayed, and both sides pulled back. Sirmium still stood under Gepid control, but the price was terrible: ruined countryside, emptied villages, and a kingdom stretched to the breaking point. When King Cunimund came to power around 560, he inherited a battered realm. The western Pannonian territories were heavily damaged, many frontier settlements lay abandoned, and the population had shrunk through war, famine, and flight. Still, the core regions of Transylvania and the Banat remained under Gepid control. From these strongholds, Cunimund tried to rebuild his kingdom's strength and find a way out of its dangerous position between Lombards, Avars, and Byzantines. To the north and east, the Avars had settled more firmly, establishing their own power centres. Reports brought back by Gepid envoys spoke of massive cavalry forces, sophisticated metallurgy, and a flexible, mobile political system focused on tribute and military dominance. The Avars wanted fertile land and control of trade routes, but their main interest seemed to lie along the lower Danube and across the open plains, not in the more mountainous Gepid heartlands. Cunimund saw a risky opportunity. If he could ally with the Avars against the Lombards, he might reverse his enemies' gains and even secure new lands. In 566 an alliance was struck. The Gepids ceded some territory to Avar settlement, paid tribute, and accepted a kind of client status within the wider Avar sphere. In return, they received promises of massive military support against the Lombards. It was a gamble born of exhaustion and necessity. For a moment it seemed to work. The joint Gepid-Avar campaign that followed began with dramatic success. In 567, combined forces moved against Lombard positions throughout western Pannonia. Avar cavalry swarmed over the countryside, cutting off supply lines and harassing defenders, while Gepid infantry advanced steadily, eliminating strong points and securing crossings. Archaeological traces show widespread destruction of Lombard settlements, burnt layers, abandoned houses, and lost valuables hurriedly buried and never reclaimed. One of the key operations was the siege of a major Lombard stronghold near the Danube, often associated with the region around Aquincum or similar sites in modern Hungary. Avar engineers tunneled under walls, set up artillery, and used methods learned from earlier steppe campaigns and captured Roman technicians. Gepid infantry ringed the fortifications to prevent sorties and escape. After months of pressure, the Lombard defense collapsed. For a brief time, it appeared that the Lombards were finished as a regional power. But victory bred new tensions. The Avars carefully catalogued, captured equipment, resources and populations, treating the conquered lands as potential future possessions, not as gifts to their Gepid allies. Disputes over plunder and the handling of civilians emerged within the coalition. In these disagreements, we glimpse the deeper conflict. The Gepids wanted security and limited expansion. The Avars saw an opportunity for full conquest. As you drift, imagine campfires where uneasy allies sit side by side, sharing food but not trust, each wondering who will betray whom first. The betrayal, when it came, was swift and devastating. As the joint forces moved towards Sirmium, Avar leaders quietly redeployed their troops to surround Gepid positions. At a chosen moment, they turned on their supposed allies. Gepid camps, unprepared for an attack from friends, found themselves struck from multiple directions by fast-moving cavalry and disciplined archers. Panic and confusion spread before coherent resistance could form. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield tells the story. Heaps of abandoned Gepid weapons, incomplete armor, and destroyed command gear suggest a sudden collapse. Specialized Avar anti-infantry units, armed and trained specifically for fighting heavy foot soldiers, appear in the material record. The pattern of damage and loss points to a carefully planned operation, not an impulsive act. In that chaos, King Cunimund fell, trying to rally his troops for a last stand against overwhelming odds. His death symbolized more than a lost battle. It marked the end of Gepid independence. Later stories, especially from Lombard tradition, claim that their king Alboin had Cunimund's skull turned into a drinking cup, a gruesome trophy used in feasts. Whether literally true or not, the tale captures the deep hostility and symbolic weight of the Gepid's fall. In any case, the Avars moved quickly to dismantle the kingdom's political and military structures, preventing any chance of recovery. The Gepid Golden Age ended not with a slow decline, but with a single, brutal break. After the final defeat, Avar administrators wasted no time remaking the former Gepid kingdom. Administrative centers were seized and repurposed. Archives and official seals were destroyed, erasing the documentary backbone of Gepid governance. Fortresses like Sirmium, once the pride of Gepid engineering, were carefully dismantled or weakened in strategic ways, enough to prevent their future use as rebel strongholds, but not so much that they couldn't host Avar garrisons and administrators. For ordinary Gepids, the consequences varied. In some areas, especially in Transylvania, communities continued to live on their ancestral lands, but under new overlords. Their pottery, tools, and some burial customs persisted for generations, now mixed with Avar-style objects and tribute tokens. In more sensitive strategic zones, populations were uprooted, scattered, or taken as dependents to other regions. Treasure hoards buried in haste and never recovered tell of families who fled, hoping to return one day and dig up what they had hidden. Beyond the Avar realm, many Gepid refugees crossed into Byzantine territory. There, imperial authorities faced a dilemma. These newcomers strained resources but offered valuable knowledge. Former Gepid officers and soldiers were integrated into frontier defenses, bringing with them experience in both Germanic warfare and steppe tactics. Their insights helped Byzantium design new fortifications and strategies against the very Avars who had destroyed their homeland. Thus, even in exile, the Gepids shaped the military evolution of the region. Life under Avar rule in the former Gepid lands produced a complex and surprisingly resilient cultural mix. Avar elites demanded tribute and military support, but often left local agricultural systems intact. They needed the food, tools, and craft output that sedentary communities provided. As a result, many Gepid farming villages continued their routines, though now paying a share of their harvest and labor to nomadic overlords instead of their own kings. Material culture reflects this blending. In cemeteries, traditional Gepid brooches and belt fittings appear alongside Avar horse harness pieces and decorative motifs. Pottery styles merge with forms and decorations drawn from both traditions. Administrative practices, too, became hybrid. Archaeological evidence shows permanent bureaucratic centers staffed by people from diverse backgrounds, Germanic, Romanized, and Avar, using multiple scripts and languages to keep records and manage tribute. Economically, the focus shifted. Instead of feeding a local kingdom and supporting long-distance trade networks centered on Sirmium and other cities, production was increasingly directed toward Avar needs, feeding large horse herds, equipping cavalry, and supplying portable luxury goods suited to a mobile elite. But beneath this new overlay, older Gepid patterns of craft, family, and village life lingered. The people had lost their kingdom, but not their entire identity. In small, daily acts, how they buried their dead, shaped their pots, or decorated their tools, they quietly remembered who they had been. Long after the last Gepid king fell, memories of the Gepids remained in the writings of others. The Gothic historian Jordanes, writing around 551, provided one of the earliest literary accounts of their origins and early expansion, though from a Gothic perspective that naturally favoured his own people. Later, the Lombard historian Paul the Deacon described Gepid-Lombard conflicts, focusing on battles and rivalries that shaped Lombard identity. Byzantine chroniclers like Procopius mentioned the Gepids mainly as federate allies or troublesome neighbors along the imperial frontier. Medieval Hungarian and Romanian chronicles written centuries later preserved more distant echoes. Anonymous authors told of ancient peoples in the Carpathian Basin before the arrival of Magyars or Slavs, sometimes merging Gepid memories with those of Goths, Huns, and other groups. Place names, fort descriptions, and legendary kings in these texts often match what archaeologists now identify as Gepid sites. Oral traditions seem to have carried fragments of truth across the centuries, even as details blurred and legends thickened. In folk tales gathered from regions once ruled by the Gepids, scholars find motifs that may preserve hazy memories of their rule. Noble warriors in the mountains, ghostly armies in the plains, and lost cities beneath the earth. While it is difficult to separate genuine historical recollections from later invention, the very persistence of these stories suggests that the Gepids left a deep imprint on the landscape and imagination of the Carpathian Basin. Even when their name was rarely spoken, their shadow lingered. Modern archaeology and science have done more than any medieval writer to bring the Gepids back into focus. From the 19th century onward, excavations in Romania, Hungary, and Serbia uncovered cemeteries, fortifications, and settlement sites that clearly belonged to a distinct East Germanic culture. The discovery of the royal treasure at Apahida, rich with gold, gems, and intricate metalwork, stunned scholars and revealed the wealth and artistry of the Gepid elite. Other sites, like Moresht and Cluj, expanded the known map of their kingdom. Archaeologists developed methods to distinguish Gepid material culture from that of Goths, Lombards, and Avars by analyzing pottery forms, grave orientation, weapon types, and jewelry styles. Over time, a detailed picture emerged where Gepids lived, how they buried their dead at different social levels, and how their culture changed from the migration period through the kingdom's heyday and final collapse. Scientific techniques like isotopic analysis and DNA studies began to trace diet, mobility, and genetic links between ancient populations and modern inhabitants of the region. Linguists, meanwhile, identified possible Gepid-related place names scattered across Romania, Hungary, and Serbia, traces of settlements and landmarks that retained old Germanic roots even after language and population shifted. Combined with genetic evidence, these clues suggest that while the Gepid political structure vanished, many of their descendants remained, gradually absorbed into new ethnic identities. In a sense, the people did not vanish, they changed their names and stories. As you relax, you can think of this as another kind of migration, not across space but across time. Today, historians see the Gepids not as a minor footnote, but as a key piece in the puzzle of post-Roman Europe. Their story shows how a small tribe from Scandinavia could, over centuries, learn, adapt, and build a sophisticated kingdom in the heart of former imperial territory. They managed complex diplomacy, balanced relationships with Rome, Goths, Huns, Lombards, and Avars, and created hybrid legal, religious, and artistic traditions that influenced the region long after their fall. Their experience also reveals the fragility of such achievements. Even a well-organized kingdom with strong fortifications and skilled leaders could be undone by changing military technology, shifting alliances, and the arrival of a more mobile, relentless power like the Avars. The Gepids' fate reminds us that the migration period was not just about barbarians destroying Rome, but about many different peoples competing, cooperating, and transforming each other in a constantly moving landscape. And yet, despite conquest and the deliberate destruction of their records, the Gepids have not been completely lost. Archaeological finds, place names, genetic traces, and stubborn folktales all keep their memory alive. As you drift deeper into sleep, you can let their long journey fade into the background, a quiet thread in the vast tapestry of European history, from northern shores to Carpathian valleys, from pagan rites to Christian prayers, from kingdom to memory. The Gepids' story continues to whisper softly through the centuries, reminding us how even slow peoples can leave lasting marks on the world.